Okay, everyone, we're going to start back for panel 3. Feel free to continue eating and enjoying your meal while we have a fruitful discussion. So, panel 3 is going to take a look at race and refugees. So we have 2 experts in the field. Our first speaker is Anthony Moore. He's a barrister from Ireland. And I first met Anthony when I was working in charge of the business law program and then eventually environmental and discrimination law at the Law School of the Law Society of Ireland. And he was one of my guest lecture tutors that I built a team of 170 people, and he was one of them, and he was so thoughtful and knowledgeable, and we really enjoyed having them in the program. Anthony is now specializing in refugee law. He has experience pleading cases in front of the Superior Court in Ireland and the Court of Justice of the European Union. And he's going to speak a little bit about the migrant crisis that we hear of today, hitting the shores of Europe. Our next speaker after Anthony, and I'll just introduce her right now, but Anthony will go first, is Professor Josephine Ross. She's at the School of Law at Howard University. And I have a special place in my heart for Howard because that's the university I went to for law school. And it produced so many good people like the great Justice Thurgood Marshall that came out of University of Howard at Washington, D.C. It's a leading institute for civil rights, and Josephine comes here today with great knowledge in the area of mass incarceration, violence, and inequality, and she's presently writing a book on Stop-and-Frisk and the situation in the United States with regards to policing and racial tensions in the U.S. So with that, I will hand it over to Anthony. Thank you, Anthony, for participating today.
Hello, Anne-Marie, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As Anne-Marie said, I'm an Irish barrister. I specialize in European law and in migration law, and I have to say I'm very glad to be able to talk to you here today about recent developments in this particular area in Europe. It's a great honor to be part of such a distinguished panel of speakers, and I hope we have a fruitful discussion. Now, Ireland is one of the 28 member states of the European Union, which is, in effect, the latest incarnation of the European Unity project begun in the aftermath of World War II. And what it attempts to create, and has created, I suppose, since then, is a degree of political and economic unity which was last seen in Europe during the Roman Empire, the western half of which we remember collapsed in 476 AD, largely because of its inability to control its external borders. Now, the current migration crisis in Europe suggests that the European Union is beginning to succumb to the same malaise. And what this paper considers is the steps which are being taken by the European Union and its member states to prevent that from happening. Now, in Europe, we have what's known as the Common European Asylum System. And what that is designed to do, it's been in existence since around 1999, is to ensure a basic degree of uniformity in the area of asylum and international protection across all the European Union member states. Over the years, various pieces of legislation have been put in place as part of that system, and the most important piece of legislation that we're going to talk about today is what's known as the Dublin Regulation. And that establishes the principle that only one member state is ultimately responsible for examining an application for asylum. And it puts in place a mechanism whereby a person who is claiming asylum in one European Union member state, like Ireland or Germany, can be returned to the European Union member state where he or she was first registered. So that's designed really to stop the problem that existed in Europe of refugees in orbit, where people went from one country to another depending on the decisions that were being made in their cases. And it was designed, as I say, to ensure that one member state was ultimately responsible for those applications. Now, the migrant crisis that has developed in Europe has exposed serious design flaws in the Common European Asylum System, but particularly with regard to the operation of the Dublin Regulation. The manner in which the migration crisis has developed has seen the burden fall on frontline states, which are most exposed to migrant flows, like Greece and Italy. Now, in Greece, deficiencies in the asylum procedure and reception conditions for asylum seekers there led to a number of cases being taken to the European Court of Human Rights and the Court of Justice of the European Union, which ultimately led to the suspension of transfers under the Dublin Regulation to Greece. So the leading case really is the case of MSS versus Belgium and Greece from 2011. And the European Court of Human Rights held there that the return of an Afghan asylum seeker from Belgium to Greece breached his rights under the European Convention on Human Rights on account of, one, deficiencies in the Greek authorities' examination of his asylum application, which exposed him to the risk of return to his home country without his case having been properly examined. And they were also held to breach Article 13 of the Convention taken in conjunction with Article 3. The return, of course, to Greece was held by the European Court to breach Article 3, that's the prohibition on degrading treatment, because his living conditions there were so poor that they were held to violate that particular prohibition. Later on that year, in December of 2011, a similar case came before the European Court of Justice, or the Court of Justice of the European Union as it's now known, in NS versus the British Secretary of State for the Home Department, where the Court of Justice adopted a similar position on transfers to Greece as that of the European Court of Human Rights, and it referred specifically and indeed with approval to the Court of Human Rights decision in MSS and Belgium and Greece. So looking now at some of the migration flows, just to give you an idea of how these are developing and have developed over the years. European statistics show that from around 2004 to 2014, by and large, there were around 200,000 to 300,000 asylum applications in Europe or in the European Union annually. But from 2011 onwards, the number of applications began to rise. It went up to around 320,000 in 2012, 430,000 in 2013, 625,000 in 2014, and last year, for the first time ever, the numbers of asylum seekers coming to the European Union, Norway and Switzerland, reached around 1.3 million. And 1 in every 4 of those applications was made by Syrian nationals. The main route for migrants currently making their way to the European Union leads from Turkey to Greece, and further onwards then through the non-European Union states of Macedonia and Serbia, where it's possible then to reach the European Union borders at the frontiers of Croatia and Hungary. So what challenges has the migration crisis posed to the European Union? Well, there are a number of these. First of all, there is the threat to the so-called Schengen System. You'll know that one of the core values upon which the European Union is founded is the principle of free movement, according to which citizens of one member state, like Ireland, can freely move around the European Union to enter into employment, self-employment, or to engage in study. And that principle has reached its apotheosis in the Schengen System. Schengen represents an area which spans 26 European countries where free movement is guaranteed and where there are no internal border controls. There's simply an external border with countries which are outside Schengen. Schengen includes the European Union member states, with the exception of Ireland, the United Kingdom, Croatia, Cyprus, Bulgaria and Romania, and also the non-European Union member states of Norway and Iceland. But of course, in order to have an area which is free from internal border control, you have to have secure internal borders. And the current extent of migration to Europe, coupled with the Islamic terrorist attacks in Paris in 2015 and the ongoing threat of similar attacks on European Union territory arising out of the conflicts in Syria and Iraq, has thrown the Schengen system into chaos. And what this has led to is a number of states reimposing border controls, which is allowed under Schengen, but really wasn't envisaged to happen all that often. Countries where controls were recently reintroduced include Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Austria, and Germany. And some of those, of course, were motivated by large numbers of migrants trying to cross the borders of those countries. That was the case certainly in Denmark, in Sweden, in Austria, and in particular in Germany, where Germany simply wasn't able to cope with the numbers arriving at its frontiers. So a priority for the European Union is to ensure that Schengen simply doesn't collapse domino-like over the next couple of months. Just the other day there, on the 22nd of February, the Bertelsmann think tank in Germany estimated that were Schengen to collapse, it could cost the European Union up to 1.4 trillion euros over the next decade as import prices rose and economic growth fell in response to the reintroduction of border controls. So the European Union is acutely aware of the dangers of Schengen collapsing, and what it has identified is a problem in particular with Greece. So there is an evaluation committee which is part of the Schengen System that carried out some research into the Greek situation, and it presented a report then which identified a number of serious deficiencies in the way Greece was managing its borders. That went up the chain of command in terms of the European institutions, and eventually a recommendation was adopted on the 12th of February this year, which recommended a number of things, including better registration procedures, sea border surveillance, better border check procedures, more human resources and training needed, and more international cooperation. And that is not good news for Greece, because unless Greece is able to identify and to comply with those measures within 3 months, and where those deficiencies exist within that period of time elapsing, Greece can effectively be expelled from Schengen. Under the Schengen Borders Code, a recommendation can be proposed by the European Commission, can be adopted then by the governments by a qualified majority, to reintroduce controls at the Greek frontier. They can be introduced for a period of up to 6 months, and they can be prolonged for additional 6-month periods up to a maximum duration of 2 years. So that carries with it now, as I say, the very real risk for Greece that unless it complies with the report and remedies these deficiencies in its control of its external borders, it could be excluded from the Schengen system. Some of the European Union member states and the non-EU Balkan states are so concerned about the numbers of migrants leaving Greece for their territory that in recent times they have shown that they're prepared to take measures outside the established channels. So on the 24th of February of this year, just the other day, Austria and 9 Balkan states agreed on a number of measures to stem the flow of migrants from Greece, including granting territory only to those who are, according to them, in proven need of protection, which will effectively allow admittance only to Syrians and Iraqis, and will exclude citizens of countries whose problems are predominantly economic in character. Now, another serious threat that the crisis poses is the threat to the right of asylum. A key European Union value is the right to asylum, which is enshrined in the European Union Charter of Fundamental Rights. And we've seen in recent times that a number of European member states, particularly those facing large influxes of migrants, are taking measures which are designed to deter them. They're at best harsh and at worst entirely contrary to their legal obligations. So an example of the former is a recent decision by Denmark to confiscate migrants' valuables to pay for their upkeep and to delay family reunification for refugees, whilst an example of the latter is the migrant cap, which entered into force in Austria on the 19th of February of this year, according to which a maximum of only 80 migrants per day are permitted to claim asylum there. So of course, it's interesting to see that the Austrians are actually prepared to wave through around 3,000 migrants per day to other countries as long as they don't claim asylum on their territory. But insofar as Austria is concerned, that particular measure has been described as being plainly incompatible with European law by the European Commission. Another serious problem that has arisen in relation to recent events is increased xenophobia in Europe. The level of uncontrolled migration has been a boon to political parties and organisations on the right of the political spectrum. The regional elections in France in 2015, which were held not long after the terrorist attacks in Paris, saw a dramatic rise in support for the National Front, while in Germany, the formerly fringe party, the Alternative for Germany, is polling very strongly ahead of regional elections this year, particularly in eastern Germany. And of course, the rise in support for those types of parties in Germany hasn't been helped by the scandalous events of New Year's Eve in 2015 in Cologne, where the German police effectively sought to cover up mass sex attacks on women by migrants, and where federal authorities later had to admit that they had identified a number of asylum seekers among the suspects for the various crimes committed that night, and which certainly shocked Germany and shocked Europe. So the European Union it could be said, at a crossroads at this particular time. It would appear that in order to survive in its current form, it needs to secure its internal borders effectively. And should it do so, it will ironically be following the example of Byzantium, the eastern half of the Roman Empire, which survived the collapse of the West until 1453, and whose capital Constantinople became largely impregnable to external threats due to its formidable defensive walls, which still dominate the outskirts of modern Istanbul. So Donald Trump, if he's listening, take note. But whilst the European Union tends to eschew any notion of building a fortress Europe, its statements in that regard are belied by the measures currently under contemplation to deal with the migrant crisis, and which I will now discuss. According to recent communications from the European Commission, particularly last January, the European Union has to step up efforts in at least 6 fields. And these are, I'll just list them: hotspots, relocation, resettlement, return, Schengen, and the creation of a European border and coast guard. So turning to the first of those, hotspots. Well, what are hotspots, you might say? Those are areas in frontline member states where, under the coordination of the various European Union agencies, there will be swift identification, registration, and fingerprinting of migrants and coordination of returns. Now, to tackle the migrant crisis in Greece, it has been decided to set up 5 hotspots in the Greek islands. Only one of those is currently operational. But nonetheless, the proportion of migrants fingerprinted as a result of this particular initiative has risen markedly, from 8% in September 2015 to 78% in January of this year. So once fully operational and equipped, the Commission expects that the hotspots should be able to fingerprint around 11,000 persons per day, which is well above the average arrival numbers for January. Italy is another country where it's also intended to have hotspots. There are 6 planned for Italy, though only 2 are operational at the moment. But in terms of recent embarkations onto Italian territory, there has been great success. There's been a 100% fingerprinting rate. And looking at the situation from September to January of this year, fingerprinting has gone up from 36% in September of last year to 87% in January of this year. And again, it's expected that they will be able to cope with the number of migrants arriving on Italian shores once they're all fully operational. As I said, the other aspect of a solution to the problem that's been identified by the European Commission is relocation. And what that means is distributing amongst the European Union member states persons who are clearly in need of international protection. But in order to have that, you need to have properly functioning hotspots, because member states like Ireland or Germany won't take in migrants unless they're properly fingerprinted and identified, and that they know, for example, that they're not going to be a security threat. One wonders, however, how successful this relocation project is going to be. In 2015, there was an emergency relocation scheme put in place for 160,000 people in need of international protection, predominantly from countries like Greece and Italy. But statistics haven't been very heartening. According to the European Commission, as of the 10th of February 2016, of the 66,000 people who are identified in Greece as being in need of relocation, only 218 have taken place so far. Only 15 member states have offered places to Greece for relocations, while another 16 have appointed liaison officers. The same situation really applies in Italy. 39,000 people were identified as being in need of relocation from Italy, but up to date, we've only seen 279 applicants being relocated. And again, the level of cooperation that the member states are giving is not particularly edifying. 15 member states have made relocation places available with pledges to receive 966 people, while 20 member states have appointed liaison officers to support the process on the ground. So really, one would wonder, will that work? And it seems that the slow rate of relocation to date is such as to call into question the viability of the scheme. And really, that seems to be a problem at a political level in the member states. Germany, because of the rise in support for far-right parties, has probably reached the end of its tether in terms of taking in migrants, while many of the Eastern European states have downright refused to take in migrants for various reasons. Moving on then to the issue of resettlement. Resettlement is another means of dealing with the migrant crisis, but what it seeks to do is to take people who have left their countries of origin and are currently in intermediate countries into the European Union and give them protection. So you might have people, for example, who left Syria who are currently in camps or on the streets in places like Lebanon or Jordan. Those are the type of people who are identified as being in need of resettlement. The other important aspect of the solution to the problem, as the European Commission sees it, is to increase the number of returns. Their thinking is that if you have a properly functioning system which identifies people in need of protection and removes people who don't, people who are not genuine refugees will be less likely to come to Europe. Now, again, the statistics on returns are not great. Around 500,000 return decisions are issued every year across the European Union, but enforcement is a problem. In 2014, for example, only 40% of irregular migrants that were ordered to leave the European Union were actually removed. So in September of 2015, the European Commission published an action plan on return. Now, that's quite a detailed document, but what it calls for is effectively more effective return of persons who have no right to be in the European Union. It focuses on voluntary return, which is the preference, but also forced return. It envisages enhanced sharing of information amongst the member states in order to increase the number of returns, strengthening the role and mandate of the European Union Border Agency, which is called Frontex, and in coordinating returns carried out by the member states. What it also does is to call for enhanced cooperation with countries of origin and transit. So, for example, in West Africa, you might have countries like Nigeria, which would be a country of origin, a source of migration to the European Union. Countries of transit then would be countries like Turkey, which I'll come back to later on. It also calls for more effective implementation of admission agreements and launching or relaunching, as the case may be, negotiations with, in particular, African countries in order to ensure easier return of their nationals who are unlawfully in the European Union member states. Again, the Commission focuses on the need to protect Schengen. We've discussed that. And then finally, it envisages a creation of a European Union Border and Coast Guard. Now, that's a rather interesting initiative, which seeks to combine the resources of that particular agency and also the member state authorities which are responsible for border management. And what it intends to do is to offer what it calls integrated border management. So that would extend beyond checks and patrols at the external border to the taking of measures in and with third countries and responsibilities behind the border, such as returning third country nationals who are irregularly in the European Union to their countries of origin. It's intended to have sufficient manpower and resources for this organisation. It's intended that it will have a rapid reserve pool of border guards and equipment, and it will be able to draw on at least 1,500 experts that can be deployed in under 3 days. Its staffing levels will double that of Frontex to reach 1,000 permanent staff, including field operatives, by 2020. National Coast Guards will be part of that agency to the extent that they carry out border tasks, and a number of other organisations, such as the European Fisheries Control Agency and the European Maritime Safety Agency, will be aligned to the Coast Guard, and they will be able to launch things like surveillance operations, including operation of drones in the Mediterranean Sea in order to assist in search and rescue operations. Member states will also be able to request joint operations and and rapid border interventions from the agency and ask that it deploy its resources to support those. An interesting and rather controversial element of the plan is that it envisages the agency having a right of intervention to secure the borders of a member state where it's under significant migratory pressure and is unwilling or unable to act to prevent it. And that, of course, didn't go down too well in Greece because it conjured up, of course, for the Greeks, images of a German battalion suddenly arriving down to man its borders. But in any event, that certainly is an interesting initiative, one which would be of assistance, and we just have to wait and see how that develops now over the coming year. Coupled with the migrant crisis, we also have the rise of terrorism in Europe. That's become all too real, as I mentioned at the introduction of this talk, owing to the activities of terrorist groups like the Islamic State in countries like Syria and Iraq, who have inspired dreadful atrocities in Europe, most recently in Paris in November 2015. And the threat to the European Union arises from a number of fronts. First of all, from third country nationals who may arrive in Europe masquerading as refugees, and indeed from its own citizens, some of whom may have travelled to places like Iraq and Syria in order to fight with their terrorist comrades. And just in terms of some examples of that, the ringleader of the Paris terrorist attacks, Abdelhamid Aboud, claimed to have moved freely from France to Syria and back again without ever being detected crossing a border. So that's one of the deficiencies of the Schengen system. Last October, a Tunisian claiming asylum under a false name in Italy was found to be an individual who had previously been deported, having been given a prison sentence in 2008 for being the head of an Al-Qaeda-linked terrorist cell in Italy. So on foot of all this and on foot of these concerns, the Commission has proposed an amendment of the Schengen Borders Code to introduce the obligation to carry out systematic checks at the external borders on all persons, including European Union citizens and members of their families, whether they're citizens or not, in order to verify that these persons don't represent a threat to public order and internal security. At present, systematic checks of European Union citizens are currently possible only in relation to the authenticity and validity of their travel documents. As regards third country nationals, they are subject to document and security checks against relevant databases upon entry, but the European Union member states have some leeway in carrying those checks out upon exit. So the proposal explicitly imposes an obligation to carry out such checks on third country nationals upon entry and exit. So the result of all this is that if this proposal is accepted, and it probably will be, checks on third country nationals and European citizens will now be mandatory when entering and exiting the European Union. There are other initiatives which have been planned in relation to terrorism, which really go outside the scope of this talk here today. But for example, I suppose the key one there would be a new directive on terrorism, which would apply to all the member states and oblige them to bring in laws which would prevent terrorist attacks by criminalising various preparatory acts, such as training, criminalising the travel abroad for terrorist purposes, as well as criminalising the aiding or abetting, inciting and attempting of terrorist acts. Another thing that the European Union has also done is to try and crack down on the throughput of illicit weapons into Europe. That's something of grave concern. There's a lot of weaponry floating around, in particular the east of Europe, and an action plan was produced by the Commission last year in an effort to try and ensure that the flow of illegal weapons was stopped into Europe. Turning now to another important feature of current EU policy, and that is cooperation with the major transit country of Turkey. Now, owing to its geographical location between Europe and Asia, Turkey is a major first reception and transit country for migrants. Currently, more than 2.5 million asylum seekers and refugees are in Turkey, and many migrants attempt to reach the European Union from Turkish soil by crossing the land borders with Greece or Bulgaria, or by travelling by sea to the Aegean Islands. Just in terms of statistics, the total number of irregular arrivals from Turkey to Greece in September, October, November and December of last year and January of this year were respectively 147,000, 214,000, 154,000, 110,000 and 67,000. Numbers had been expected to decrease due to the winter weather conditions, but they remained quite high. From 17th of December of last year to the 31st of January this year, for example, the number of irregular migrants who reached the European Union by sea from Turkey was 110,000. So in an effort to reduce the number of migrants travelling to the European Union from Turkey, the Commission has reached an agreement with Turkey on a joint action plan regarding cooperation on migrant management, which was activated at a joint summit between the European Union and Turkey in November of last year. And in broad terms, what it seeks to do is to support the Syrians who are in Turkey and the host communities there who are looking after them, and to strengthen cooperation between the European Union and Turkey in order to prevent irregular migration. And what it envisages is a discharge of various tasks by both sides. So on the Turkish side, it includes reinforcing the Turkish Coast Guard, stepping up cooperation with the Bulgarian and the Greek authorities to prevent migrants crossing their borders, stepping up cooperation in terms of readmitting irregular migrants who are not in need of international protection and who are intercepted coming across the Turkish border, and progressively aligning Turkish visa policy, legislation and administrative capacities vis-a-vis the countries representing sources of illegal migration, so that, I suppose, in effect, it acts as an impediment to their entering Turkey in the first place. On the European Union side, it involves effectively an information plan which would tell migrants in Turkey about the risks of travelling to the European Union illegally, and of the opportunities that are there for them to travel legally to Europe, supporting cooperation between the European Union member states and Turkey in organising joint return operations, enhancing the European Union's capacity to exchange information with Turkey on combating smuggling networks, and increasing the financial assistance offered to Turkey in a variety of ways, but in particular in order that Turkey can meet the requirements of a visa liberalisation dialogue which has been going on between the European Union and Turkey for some time. Now, in tandem with that, the European Commission adopted a facility for refugees in Turkey, on foot of which 3 billion will be provided to Turkey by Europe in 2016 and 2017. And that is designed to assist in providing for the basic needs of refugees in Turkey, including food, shelter, and healthcare. The first meeting of the steering committee of that facility took place in February of this year, but the delivery of that money is conditional on the implementation by Turkey of its commitments under the Joint Action Plan. We're at early days with regard to that, and it remains to be seen how that will develop. Certainly the Hungarian Prime Minister the other day was quite critical of it, and the Turks have perhaps encouraged that because they have made, I understand, some comments behind closed doors that they can effectively turn on and off the tap of migrants at will, perhaps in an effort to encourage more funding from Europe. So we'll just have to see how that pans out. But that is nonetheless an important initiative mounted by the European Union, because Turkey is one of the major transit countries, and if the migrants who are present in Turkey can be cared for there and looked after there, it does go some way towards helping the Commission in its endeavour of ensuring that migrant flows are coming to Europe and European Union territory are reduced. So just to look at that briefly before I finish, it would appear that the initiative with Turkey has had some limited impact on migration flows. In January of this year, for example, Turkey introduced visa obligations for Syrians travelling to Turkey from countries like Lebanon and Jordan. And the number of Syrians travelling to Turkey from the Lebanon and Jordan fell from 40,000 between the first week of January of this year to 1,000 the following week, a reduction of 40,000. The Turks have also given the Syrians who have temporary protection on its territory access to the labour market, and that is designed to make Turkey a more attractive country for migrants, especially for the Syrians, and reduce their desire to travel to the European Union. So, just to conclude really on that, there are a number of other actions that need to be taken by Turkey urgently. The European Commission has identified these. First of all, it feels that it should conclude readmission agreements with countries which are sources of migration. It should also conclude a readmission agreement with Europe so that it can take back third country nationals. The deadline for that is June 2016. And also, of course, as I said, aligning visa policy with the European Union and increasing the capacity of its Coast Guard. So, in conclusion then, the migrant crisis has certainly posed significant challenges to the European Union and its member states. The influx of migrants has led to a potential breakdown in core principles which one takes for granted, whether it be the right of free movement in the European Union on the one hand, or indeed the right of persons fleeing protection to asylum and protection on the other. Policymakers in Europe have identified ways in which those two interests can be safeguarded, And we can only hope, I suppose, that as the summer begins and the migrant flows in the Mediterranean increase again, the European Union's institutions and governments responsible for enacting them will be successful. So that concludes my talk. I'd like to thank you again for listening to me here today. I hope you found it informative and certainly look forward to talking to you again, perhaps at some stage in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. If there's a quick question, we could take one right now before we go on to Professor Ross. All right, thank you, Anthony. Thanks a million for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye. Well, hello, everybody. This has been an amazing conference. I'm so glad to be here in the middle of Canada. My first time in Saskatoon, my first time in Saskatchewan. So thank you for inviting me, and I can't believe how good the attendance is here. So and people are really engaged, etc. So what I'm going to talk about today is about policing. I teach at Howard University School of Law, which, as many of you know, is historically black university, and I've learned a lot from my students over the years. I teach a course called Criminal Procedure, which is about how the Constitution limits the police in terms of, at least theoretically, that's what we're going to talk about today in part, limits what the police can do to individuals, the Fourth and Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution. I also, for the last 10 years, have been in court with students. I have been teaching a criminal clinic, criminal defense, so the students go to court with me and they represent clients. I just sit and watch them do a good job. So it was natural that when I wanted to write a book that it would be about stop and frisk. I come to it from a variety of different angles. And right now, my goal is for it to be a crossover book, not just for lawyers, but for other people to understand what's going on as well. And I have a current title that's so new I have to read it. It's called The Hidden Harms of Stop and Frisk. And so in it, I'm arguing a couple of things. One, it does not make us any safer. Two, it has many invisible harms that include fueling inequality in the criminal justice system. It can be, stop and frisk can be more invasive and violent than generally is understood. And it can also be sexually demeaning, something else that's not generally discussed. And finally, that it diminishes fundamental rights, really, of all people in America, not just Americans. So what is stop and frisk policing? If I wanted to be able to come out there, but I was told this is being taped, so I got to stay back here. So if I'm a police officer and I say, you know, hey, you, come here, you know, come right over here, that is called a stop. I've just detained Dr. Cotter, and it can be a short detention, but that is what makes it a stop. Now, what the Constitution says is that stop is supposed to be based on reasonable suspicion, can't be fanciful. But in reality, it's based on things like people walking on the street with a bulge, that's their cell phone in their pocket, really suspicious behavior. And another thing that crops up a lot is they call it furtive movements, where somebody looks like they don't want to interact with the police. So much
a lot of behavior that you and I would say, well, that's completely innocent, counts as suspicious behavior. The frisk part is now I have Dr. Cotter. I get to pat her down if I have reasonable suspicion that she's armed and dangerous on the outside of her clothing and all the way down to the bottom of her pants. And I'm not supposed to go into her pockets unless I have probable cause, but in fact, the stories that people tell, it happens all the time, that the frisk turns into a search. So the frisk is supposed to be for weapons, but in reality, people are frisked for a variety of other reasons. Now, stop and frisk is really understood best through the New York number crunching. Nowhere else in the U.S. have the numbers been better crunched than from, and here are the dates, 2004 to 2012 in New York. They became the basis of a lawsuit and were very, very thoroughly evaluated, and experts from both sides about what they meant, et cetera. So in those years, 4.4 million stops, and among those, 2.3 million of these stops, people were patted down. Over 80% of these interventions involved Black and Hispanics. At the height of the city stop and frisk mandate, which was 2011, the focus on Black males between the ages of 14 and 24 was so pronounced that the number of stops that year exceeded the total population of that demographic. Do I need to say that again, or you got it, right? Yeah, so it was quite massive. That's what we're talking about when we say community control. The officers were told to go out and have a certain number of contacts, as they were called. Now, does it make us safer? John Jay College of Criminal Justice recently tracked the figures from 2003 to 2014, and they looked at crime rates as against stop and frisk, and they said stop and frisk does not prevent serious crime. The judge in the case that I've just described took a look at the number of people that were issued summonses and arrests, and she said, and this is in her opinion, that the stopped population was overwhelmingly innocent. So that brings us back to that first speaker that we heard today that talked about that there is no contradiction between, what did he say, security versus human rights, right? That people try to make it one versus the other. This is a great example of how we don't have to say one versus the other. It does not make us safer. I know that everyone cares about the innocent, but maybe it's because I'm a public defender. I care about the guilty more. The people that are stopped and they find drugs on them, this is even worse for what's going on in the United States. I mean, America, we really like to lock people up. I don't know if you realize how much we like doing it, but for the last 30 years, our incarceration rate has increased 500%. So Canada, you don't do quite as well as Europe, but for 188 people locked up for 100,000 in other words, for every 100,000 people, you lock up 188 people. That's what you do in Canada. In the United States, we lock up 478, so we win. 2.5 times more than you do. And you know that a lot of the inequality comes from the drug war. 2/3 of people locked up for drug crimes are either Black or Latino, right? So that has really, the drug war has fueled the inequality. Now, who gets arrested for stop and frisk? The #1 big crime, possession of marijuana, right? That's the #1 crime that they net. So when you think about mass incarceration and inequality, and then you look at stop and frisk, you realize we have like a funnel here, and the stop and frisk is the part of the funnel, the wide part where you bring people into the system, and then from there you can start getting to an equality. So it's not just about sentencing, it starts at the beginning. So, for black males in their 30s, 1 in 10 is in prison or jail on any given day in the US. Now, what I like to do with my students for pro bono work is we go into schools or a diversion program called Youth Court, and we like to teach their rights. So when they're stopped by police, what are their rights? So one day, I had a class, and we were about to go do a training, our first training. And so I had my law school students help me prepare what they were going to do, because they do most of the teaching. I just add in things and look good. But so, so what I told them about is this a fundamental right called the freedom to leave. And basically what the Supreme Court says is, okay, if you're in a car and you get the blue lights, you have to pull over. That's a stop. But if a police officer walks up to you on the street and starts saying, hey, ma'am, where are you going? Do you have any drugs on you? Well, that isn't a stop. You have an absolute right to walk away. That's what the court has said again and again and again for, 30 years more. So I say to my students, should we tell them about this fundamental right? We're teaching Know Your Rights, right? And we're teaching them about stop and frisk. And the students are like, no, don't do that. Like in my neighborhood, that'd get you arrested. And another person said, or shot. And one student said, it would be irresponsible for us to teach that right to young people. And I thought that he not only had a sort of authoritative, booming voice, but he also had been a cop for 6 years before he got into law school. So I thought he knew what he was talking about. And of course, my students were proved right. The numbers just got crunched from 2015, and a full 1/4 of the people that have been shot by police that year had been caught in a chase, running, in other words. Fleeing from police is dangerous. And in addition, walking away doesn't necessarily get you shot, but it can be dangerous too. There is a video that went viral on YouTube, and I'm hoping some of you saw it. The name of the woman was Charlena Michelle Cooks. Here's this woman who is very visibly pregnant. She's a black woman, 8 months pregnant, and it is the silliest argument to begin with. It has to do with whether she parked badly, and she and another, she was dropping her child off at school, and she and another woman had an argument, and the woman called the police and told him that, she threw coffee at my car and she was really cursed at me. And the officer says, well, ma'am, there's been no crime here, but I'll investigate. And then he goes over to her, and when she stays, she tells her side of the story, but when she says, I don't know if I have to give you my identification information, he starts getting more aggressive. And she calls somebody on the phone, do I have to give this information, trying to follow the constitutional law? The answer is, of course, she does not. But he basically says, give me your information. And she says, I don't feel comfortable. As she's walking away, he makes the signal to arrest her. And you can see her being tackled as she's screaming, I'm pregnant, and is physically forced to the ground. So my students were right. It's a very upsetting video. I was thinking of showing it to you, but I'm glad I didn't. And I've talked to some of you, and I know that you are sort of up to speed on some of what we get that way from the US. So I think this is one of the hidden harms of stop and frisk, that our rights are being eviscerated and people don't even know them. At one of the trainings I was at, the young man who was sitting in the sort of a jury box area, listening pretty intently to the training the students were doing, called me over at one point. And he said, I just wondered if there's anything I can do. He said that he's been stopped a lot of times, but the last time that they stopped and frisked him, he said it felt like a rape. And was there anything he can do? So I've been doing more research recently in the social science area, because a lot of times, and this is really important for all you law students and lawyers out there, sometimes law gets away from reality, and social science has a way of bringing it back. And so it can be very helpful whether you're writing briefs or whether you're writing a paper for your law school curriculum. Looking at the social science is really important. So what social science has said is, first of all, that a lot of these are very aggressive, including hitting, punching, and kicking, and also a lot include name calling, such as homophobic comments and racial comments. So that's been documented through these qualitative studies. But in addition, now I've completely lost where I was. Here, okay. So in addition, there was an article published in the American Journal of Public Health that said they're looking at both drug users and non-drug users and trying to see about their relationship within a section of New York that was heavily policed, to see how they responded. And one of the things that sort of I thought was alarming is among the non-drug users, 12% reported that they'd either witnessed sexual violence at the hands of police or been victimized by it. And even more alarming, of the people that did inject drugs, 33% of those were victims or witnessed this sexual violence by police. So this is one of these hidden things that's very, very rarely discussed, but is definitely a harm. The other thing that social science is finally starting to do is not just say, oh, we have a problem with trust, because that's what they, for 10 years we get these articles that say people aren't trusting the police when they get, kicked and thrown against walls. And that's bad for everybody, because then they don't want to cooperate with the police. Well, finally, in 2014, 3 social scientists came together and they started looking at trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder. What are those kind of harms that are happening? And what they found out was that there's more trauma symptoms among respondents reporting lifetime stops. So yes, trauma to stops, there is this link that they suspected and they found. But what they found even more was that the more intensive the stop, the more likelihood of PTSD. So it was, a number of stops was important, but the intensity was even more important. They concluded stop-and-frisk creates a risk of serious health consequences. And there's another social science article that isn't even published yet, but it's about to be published in the Journal of Urban Health, and they're looking at collateral consequences. This is a really new idea. Instead of just saying, okay, there's a problem with how people's health is, I don't know if it's plural or singular, but instead of looking at it individually, how does it affect the individual, they're looking at community health. And they did this on a big scale. And they were looking at measures like diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, overall health conditions. And what they found was people do not have to be inside the criminal justice system to feel the effects of the criminal justice system. This is another quote. The shape that aggressive policing shapes the health of people who have not yet entered into its gates. So the consequences are not just The consequences are not just about trust. They're not just about whether there's psychological damage, although that connects with these physical damages. And this is all very much not known, not discussed, and I think that it will really help unpack the argument. Now, what is discussed a lot, and I'm sure all of you are up on it, is the killings. After Ferguson in 2014, in the summer of 2014, with all those protests after Michael Brown was killed, they realized that they didn't even have statistics about police killings. So the Washington Post and The Guardian from London began tracking the actual number of killings. And so the 2015 statistics are out, and they're interesting. So overall, in 2015, black people were killed at twice the rate of white, Hispanic, and Native Americans. For 2015, about 1 in every 65 deaths. So if you have somebody between the ages of 15 and 34, that age, black young man who was killed, 1 out of 65 of those deaths was at the hand of police. It's a pretty shocking number. And ProPublica looked at a 3-year data, and they said that the extent of inequality between blacks being killed and whites being killed, basically you would need 1 white young man to be killed every week for 3 years to catch up to the statistics for black people. Now, when I was originally asked to be on this podium, I said international. I might not mention international, but I'm glad to tell you, Dr. Cotter, I found a good link for international law, and that is about what the World Health Organization has said about some of this. First of all, they classify excessive use of force by police as a human rights violation. That's from 2004. And they write in this report, all police action shall respect the principles of legality, necessity, non-discrimination, proportionality, and humanity. And in an earlier report, they were talking about excessive use of force, and they say it helps create a climate in which violence is encouraged. So stop-and-frisk problem might seem small, but it links up to the general killings and injuries, and it links up to world health as well, and it links up to international law. So how to connect the individual stop and frisk to the big killings? Well, one way to think about it is this Harvard professor looked at the numbers and he said, you know, the issue really isn't so much that police, once they have somebody, are more likely to kill you if you're black. It's really about who gets into their reaches in the first place. And he said, if you look at the numbers, really it's just that every police encounter contains a risk. So he's an economist, you can tell, he talks like an economist, right? So that's the correlation, and that explains how the connection is between stop and frisk and these and the unequal killings. And so we know stop and frisk is violent in itself, but we also see that it is a gateway to further violence. Now, Eric Garner, is that a familiar name? Anybody here heard of Eric Garner? People know his last words, right, which were, I can't breathe. That's became the rallying cry. That's what people remembered. He's the one who was taken down, big guy in New York City, taken down a chokehold because they thought that he might have been selling single cigarettes. But what people don't know is that 7 years before he was pulled down by police that day and killed, 7 years before, he had filed a lawsuit. And in that lawsuit, he said that an officer had stopped him and dug his fingers into my rectum in the middle of the street, and that his shorts were unzipped. They inspected his genitals in the middle of the street. All the while, there were people passing back and forth. Under injuries, Eric Gardner wrote he received injuries to his manhood. And that made me look quite differently than when you look at that video again and you see him say, every time you see me, you want to mess with me. Please just leave me alone. I told you the last time, please just leave me alone. Please, please don't touch me. Do not touch me. And those were the last words before they came in and pulled him down. So there are some things that people don't know, even though there's so much out there. And the takeaway that I'd like to leave you with is that when we're thinking about curtailing mass incarceration, we have to look beyond just the sentencing. We have to look at the big funnel part of the mass incarceration. And similarly, when we're looking at police violence, we got to look beyond just who gets shot, who gets choked. We have to look at the funnel, at the beginning of it. And in the end, what I hope we do when we are reforming the criminal justice system is abolish stop and frisk and make it not be a method of control for a population. Thank you.